Poland's Prime Minister says his country is the closest it's been to open conflict since World War II. This after NATO fighter jets shot down Russian drones, it says entered Polish airspace. Scorched earth shows where the drones hit the ground.
Yeah, according to Prime Minister Donald Tusk, there were 19 intrusions in all, and many of the drones came into Polish airspace from neighboring Belarus, an ally of Russia. He said that he's activated NATO's Article 4, which sets the stage for consultations with NATO allies. Tusk also adds that it's the first time Russian drones have been shot down over a NATO member state's territory. After a meeting with Poland's National Security Bureau, Tusk said his country is ready to repel what Poland is calling Russia's act of aggression.
We are most likely dealing with a large-scale provocation, but at the same time we're in consultation with our allies. I am in constant contact with the NATO Secretary General. This is so that we can respond to this type of threat as effectively as we did tonight.
Nick Payton-Walsh is following the story. He filed this report.
Behind me here is a meeting of what's called the E5 top European defence officials. The Polish defence minister meant to be had to rush back to deal with the crisis in his own country. The French defence minister, actually now the Prime Minister, but still a message here of unity they're trying to give out. The UK Defence Secretary John Healey calling this a new level of hostility from Russian President Vladimir Putin, and saying that the actions taken by NATO jets, Dutch aircraft scrambled to intercept these drones, marks the first defensive action of its kind since Russia invaded Ukraine. What we know is that during the night, 19 intrusions were recorded by Poland into their airspace. That may not mean 19 separate drones, but certainly 4 of them shot down, according to some initial Polish official reports. And indeed, damage done to civilian infrastructure from that debris falling. Extraordinary to see some of the video. The noises we've become accustomed to hearing over Ukraine now over NATO territory. Russia's Ministry of Defense, referred to for answer on this by the Kremlin, have said they did not intend to target Polish sites. That's not the same as saying they didn't intend to send drones into Polish airspace, but they're also saying they're open to dialogue with Poland on this matter. Polish airspace closed during the bid to counter these drones. Extraordinary to even imagine, frankly, this moment of NATO's eastern flank security being in doubt this far into Russia's invasion of Poland. A significant escalation by Moscow, whether they try to suggest this was potentially a navigational error or the result of GPS jamming or something, as they may do in the days ahead. Clearly a designed move here to test NATO's response. So far, when I stepped out of here, we have not heard of concrete measures potentially from NATO to respond to this, or the UK Defence Minister did say they would be instructing UK forces to look at ways of bolstering Poland's air defences. But a real moment of test here, certainly for the White House as well. I should remind everybody that on Sunday, when asked after her pretty horrific record assault against Kiev, President Trump was asked if he was ready for the next wave of sanctions against Russia. He said he was. He said he talked to Vladimir Putin very soon. He said indeed that European leaders would be going to DC to talk with him about that. None of that has happened now on Wednesday, and he said those visits would occur by Tuesday. So a lot of questions now as to Trump's response, whether there will be a unified NATO response, including the US, to this extraordinary, unprecedented violation of Poland's airspace. I should point out there are many concerned that this may just be the beginning, that Russia may be trying to test and see what pushback it gets from NATO from trying something like this, and then may again try to violate Poland or other Eastern NATO members' airspace. And indeed, I should also point out to everybody that this was part, it seems, these drones launched as part of another substantial attack against Ukraine. 400 drones launched that same night. The fact that some of them strayed into NATO airspace, a remarkable sense that the Kremlin feels buoyed, feels potentially after the summit in Tianjin that it had in the beginning of this month, that it has increased support from China and possibly India, and certainly we've seen over the past 48 hours with 24 pensioners killed in a single strike in Donetsk by a Russian aerial bomb, Moscow upping its aggression rather than the opposite.
Many thanks to Nick Payton-Walsh for that report. Let's get some more perspective on this. Let's bring in the former US Ambassador to Poland and Sweden, Mark Brzezinski. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. certainly the perfect person to talk to about all of this. So here's the thing. Russia is saying this was an accident. Most experts believe that this was possibly intentional to some degree. We know that Article 4 was triggered. That triggers consultations, but not necessarily a military reaction. When it comes to NATO's response, given that Vladimir Putin only seems to understand the language of aggression, what is the right response by NATO here, do you think?
It's hard to avoid the conclusion that there is a degree of mission creep on Putin's part as he continuously spreads this conflict to the West. And you remember that for President Joe Biden, the worry about expanding the war was the fundamental worry. And it looks, frankly, like President Putin, step by step, is doing that. It's hard to believe that 19 incursions, multiple drone attacks on Poland last night were a quote accident. In 2022, when I was ambassador here in Poland, and 2 Polish citizens were killed by an errant missile that came in from the east, the Kremlin was the first to the podium to say that this was an accident. It was not from them. It was an accident deployed by the Ukrainians. This time, the Russians did not exactly deny that they were behind this. And so, this is a step-by-step escalation at a time when President Trump, and I applaud him for doing this, when President Trump is trying to bring the Russians and Ukrainians together, it looks like Putin is simply not keeping his word and, creating a context in which peace and a ceasefire can be found.
So, Ambassador, given everything you just laid out, how fine is the line now between deterrence and escalation at this point? NATO members seem to agree that this is Vladimir Putin testing the resolve of NATO allies. But with that response now from NATO also comes a significant risk.
Well, look, these are, armed drones coming into NATO territory. Thank goodness no one was hurt or killed in Poland yesterday, because Poland is a NATO alliance member, and it would have triggered Article 5, in which technically an attack on one is an attack on all, and the response would have been technical as well. We don't want this horrific conflict in Ukraine, which has claimed over 1 million casualties, to spread. But that's precisely what these incursions can trigger. And so I think it's important to answer the previous question that NATO make an extremely clarified response to Putin, that this was not okay, that there will be consequences, and those consequences aren't just threats, that they happen now in the form of sanctions, in the form of some kind of joint cooperation between the NATO countries to create bulwarks against drone attacks and drone incursions from Russia. Something should be done to visibly convey to Putin that there will be consequences when these things happen, and this is step one of those.
Is this the kind of thing that will at least trigger a greater increase in European defense spending at the very least?
That's a great question. And I think even a couple weeks ago, after the Trump-Putin meeting in Alaska, there was a focusing of the minds among European leadership that Ukraine is not just an American problem. It's actually a European problem. And the Europeans are going to have to cooperate, develop a security strategy, and begin to deploy resources, meaning money, to pay for security and ultimately the rebuilding of Ukraine. I think this will what happened last night in Poland, a NATO-pact country, an EU country, will further concentrate the minds of the Europeans. That the Europeans will have to collectively engage on this and develop probably a European unified response to address this. But I'm hopeful, based on what happened the last couple of weeks, that the European leaders are up for it.
Is this not, though, Ambassador, Putin once again thumbing his nose at President Trump specifically? It was the president who had just welcomed the Prime Minister last week at the White House. And you also now have Europeans, rightly so, expressing alarm Will that message only be delivered to Vladimir Putin now as sharply as you say it should, if it comes from President Trump, though?
My worry is that President Putin isn't really interested in peace, frankly. My worry is that he is a KGB agent who has resolve. He does not want to be seen by his people and by himself as losing to a fellow Slavic country, and that he will continue the war despite horrific casualty numbers already, because he wants all of Ukraine and maybe even to destabilize the eastern part of NATO that used to be within the former Soviet bloc. When the former Soviet bloc broke up, 26 countries emerged, as you know. Some of them have joined the West very successfully, and some have stumbled along. And what we have now is Putin attacking the weaker ones, but turning greater attention, per the incursion in Poland last night, to the more successful former Warsaw Pact countries that are part of the West, maybe in an effort to try to destabilize them.